Good afternoon. My name is John Boyer, and on behalf of Tom Miles, I'd like to welcome you to this lovely celebration in honor of our colleague, Dennis Hutchinson. The meeting today is going to be in two parts. We're going to have some comments from former colleagues and friends of Dennis in this hour, and then we're going to adjourn to a reception room, which is just upstairs for the next hour. So please be sure to stay on for the second part of our comments. Dennis joined the University of Chicago. By the way, Dennis is sitting right here. If you, so I should address my. Okay, in actually 1981, so I think it's 41 years on the faculty. He joined the law school in the New Collegiate Division of the college in 1981. He went through all the ranks, associate professor without tenure, first of all without tenure, and then with tenure, full professor, and then in 2000 was appointed the William Rainey Harper Professor in the college, in the law school. He has been an extraordinary scholar, written a number of books, many articles, was our colleague Jeff Stone and David Strauss, the co-editor of the Supreme Court Review since 1981. But I think we're here to celebrate primarily, not exclusively, his extraordinary impact on this community as a teacher, as a mentor, as a citizen who is engaged in such a profound impact on the affairs and the culture of both of these great institutions, the law school and the college. So we have 6 colleagues who are going to be commenting on Dennis's life and work and his impact on their lives. 3 colleagues representing the college. So this is the college team here, and then they're going to be replaced by the law school team. So from the college, we're honored to have Rebecca Jarvis, who's a 2003 graduate of the college, who is majored in law, letters, and society. She spoke to our class day ceremonies a couple of years ago quite eloquently and memorably. She's now, as you may know, the chief business and economics correspondent of ABC News, and you may have something later to do this afternoon or evening. I heard there's an election going on or something like that. Yeah, okay. So thank you, Rebecca, for coming. Next, Andrew Hammond, who's a graduate of the college in 2007, Rhodes Scholar winner, who is now associate professor of law at the University of Florida and is going to be joining the faculty of the Indiana Law School in January of 2023. And he worked with Dennis as assistant and associate director of the Law, Letters, and Society program, of which Dennis was the director for many, many years. And then finally, Jonathan Levy, who's my colleague in the history department, is the James Westfield Thompson Professor of U.S. History. He's on many, many committees, organizations, and so forth. But he's here as the chair of our Law, Letters, and Society major. He succeeded Dennis as the faculty leader. He's the author of several books, important books, including a massive book published in 2021 by Random House called The Ages of American Capitalism, History of the United States. So I'm delighted all of you were able to come. I think Rebecca's going to speak first, Andrew second, and actually that's the way you're set up. So okay, so I just hand the mic off.
Sure, I have this mic on.
Okay.
Well, it's great to be here with you, Dennis, and your family and your friends, and to just recount some of my memories of you over the years. It was 23 years ago, in September 1999, my first week at the University of Chicago, when I sat in a packed Rockefeller Chapel listening to Dennis Hutchinson give the annual and highly prestigious Aims of Education address. That is the talk given to incoming UChicago students. And 2 things occurred to me during this conversation. First, I was at the school of my dreams, a different kind of place where no idea was off limits. And second, I was going to be taking a lot of classes from this guy, Professor Hutchinson, who had just referenced Plato, the great commercial law teacher Grant Gilmore, and the film The Godfather, all in the same speech, and who'd just given us permission to indulge the impulses of a dilettante. More on that in a moment. On the classes front, I took all of them from legal reasoning onward, and it is a very special kind of experience to take a class from Dennis Hutchinson. I was trying to think of the appropriate analogy to share with you here tonight, and I came up with this description. Attending Dennis Hutchinson's class is like visiting a haunted house, an experience in which you know you're going to be scared, but you pay admission, in this case tuition, for the privilege and excitement of the scare. There is the lead up, the anticipation as you mentally prepare for entry. Once you're inside, it's exhilarating. Anything can happen, which occasionally leads to moments of panic. For example, to hear your name followed by an unanticipated question from Hutch can feel like a ghoul just jumped out of the wall and lunged at you. It's shocking, you love it, and you hope no one, especially not him, can spot the terror in your eyes. To watch this happen to a fellow student can be devilishly delightful, but in the end, it's a thrill. And you leave feeling in a sense of awe and appreciation for what you just experienced. Appreciation for what Hutchinson does with each of his seminars, engaging everyone, knowing every student by name, and perpetuating the greatest of debates. In my case, that gratitude also extends well beyond the classroom. 2 years out of the University of Chicago, I was here in Chicago working in investment banking, and I was miserable, basically from the start, spending countless hours analyzing data on such scintillating topics as regional trends in yogurt consumption. Okay, you get it. Good. I wanted to quit to pursue journalism, but many of the adults in my life, including my very well-intentioned parents, were really apprehensive about this decision, and they encouraged me instead to tough it out, choose stability. That was their message. But that wasn't Hutchinson's message. He would check in with me frequently in those early years, listening as I agonized over the decision, and he'd always ask the right questions. He never overtly directed me, but he gave me the nudge I needed to take that leap. And when I ultimately made the decision to move on from investment banking, I wasn't sure where the path would take me, other than away from yogurt analysis. But knowing Hutchinson was in my corner gave me the confidence to keep going. And it's helped propel me out of that cubicle and onto CNBC and to CBS News and to ABC News today. Now, when I am wrestling with difficult questions at work, covering complex stories, wondering how best to frame a question, Dennis sits on a kind of board of directors in my mind. This has helped me navigate some of the most challenging moments in my career. And it's also helped launch some of the most fulfilling endeavors in my career, which brings me back to his Aims of Education address. At one point, you encouraged us to pursue the extracurricular and to indulge the impulses of a dilettante without succumbing to the standards of a dilettante. I did my share of that in college, but it was that wisdom that also helped propel me to a career-defining project about Elizabeth Holmes, the woman who was supposed to change the world with her blood testing technology. When I first pitched that story inside of ABC News, my bosses weren't quite as passionate about it as I was. There was a big election, it was 2016, and it was taking up all the oxygen in the room. So I started pursuing the story just as Hutchinson had recommended back in 1999, as an extracurricular, purely because it fascinated me. And for 3 years, my team and I worked mostly below the radar with little attention paid to my pet project. And then came the criminal fraud charges in 2018. Elizabeth Holmes' $10 billion company became worthless overnight. And the media was suddenly very interested. And my team and I had the story because I was a dilettante. It became a podcast, which soared to #1. It was developed into a Hulu series. I'm an executive producer. These are all neat outcomes, but my favorite part of the entire experience was the work, pursuing an idea for the enjoyment of it, a path I chose because I was following your advice, Dennis. And I know I'm not alone, not only because I've read it on the internet on Rate My Professor, but because I see the way students' faces light up when I ask them about you. You have made an immeasurable impact. And because of you, the University of Chicago became my movable feast. a place where I was simultaneously nourished and always hungry. You fed, and to this day, feed my unremitting passion for the conversation. You taught me to ask the right questions, and your teachings, mentorship, and friendship continue to light my path. Good luck and Godspeed, Dennis Hutchinson.
Hi, everyone. It's such an honor to be back in Hyde Park, honoring Dennis with all of you. And I really see myself as just a mere messenger on behalf of all the students who studied with Dennis in the college, like Rebecca. And just thinking about Dennis's legacy, I guess I do have a vantage point, having been his student and then having to help teach in the Law, Letters, and Society program under John Levy's leadership. I want to talk a little bit about the kind of components of Dennis's work in the college, and then try and make the case that it's far greater than the sum of its parts. So I think, as Rebecca alluded to, Dennis's classes in the college are considered legendary, and that's not just true for people in the Law, Letters, and Society program. People would seek out classes to take with Dennis, whether they were majoring in mathematics or physics or political science or classics. And his legal reasoning class, however, was limited to Law, Letters, and Society students, much to the chagrin of many other students in the college. But that class, having now taught it here, I didn't realize the mountain of work that Dennis put into teaching undergraduate students in their second year in the college legal reasoning. I mean, it seems I teach 1L classes now, but that pales in comparison to the challenges that Dennis faced in teaching the legal reasoning course. And it's the required course in the Law, Letters, and Society program, and kind of sets up students for not only for the rest of their time in the college, but beyond. His American Law and the Rhetoric of Race class, in many ways ahead of its time, but also kind of timeless. It's a class that I've had law professors refer to in my law school classroom, and the kind of intimidation that Rebecca alluded to was certainly true when I've talked to students who took that class with him. But it's a class that I reached out to a lot of former students. It's the class that, for many, it was the kind of defining course they took in the college, which says a lot given this undergraduate institution. When I took classes with Dennis, he had developed an obsession, I would say, with arguably our greatest president, Abraham Lincoln. He had taught a seminar with Ralph Lerner about Ben Franklin and Lincoln, and then he'd kind of pursued it on his own, placing Lincoln in the anti-slavery movement, the jurisprudence, and he let a lot of us take that second Lincoln class, even though we had taken the Franklin and Lincoln class because we begged him. But the second part of his role in Law Letters, which I didn't appreciate until I was part of the program teaching in it, was the intensive supervision. And I don't know if it was, I haven't really asked you this, Dennis, if it was because of your time at Oxford that you took that kind of tutorial supervision so seriously, but Dennis really held on to undergraduates doing original research at a time when higher education has kind of stepped away from that in some ways. Some majors no longer require an undergraduate thesis, and Law Letters BA paper process is seen as quite rigorous. It's something that might make students think twice about pursuing the Law Letters major. But what I didn't realize is that Dennis, not only, in his words, he would have to beg, borrow, and steal supervisors for these undergraduate theses, and I'm looking at people who I know he begged and borrowed and stole from, but Dennis himself supervised several BA papers each year. And then there were those of us who, like me, walked up to his office in the law school begging to do an independent study. And he was very willing to let students direct their own study, especially in the last year. And then the kind of final component, again, something I didn't fully appreciate until I was working in the Law, Letters, and Society program, was his approach to mentorship, which again, you kind of take for granted as a student. But, and I know this is true for a lot of people here, he's a kind of thoughtful, dedicated correspondent, always sending articles and books, recommendations, and pushing us in terms of what we're working on, what are we reading, what are we thinking. And I guess I'll close by saying that the kind of greater, the sense that this is greater than the sum of its parts. Dennis basically built a bridge from the main quad, from the college to the law school. And he built a bridge that allowed undergraduates to engage with one of the great law schools in the country. There aren't other American universities that have done that. And it's something that enriched the lives of undergraduates. And I am willing to go out on a limb and say it's had positive externalities for the college and the law school as well. And I don't know if that is not replicable at other universities, or why people haven't followed UChicago's lead yet, but they still might. But I think that that's, it was a kind of Herculean task, and it's something that took decades, but you did it, Dennis. And it's something that students in the college routinely tell me it's really enriched and shaped their education. So I'm only in my 4th year as a law professor. I'm still figuring out what academia even is, but something I'm getting an appreciation for is what you value most in colleagues are honest words and generous acts. And Dennis, talking to other students, reaching out to them in preparation for this event, I'm continually reminded of the honesty of your words and the generosity of your acts. So thank you so much.
Good afternoon, good evening. I'm already so touched listening to these comments. It's a pleasure to be here to join this tribute and to proudly represent the Law, Letters, and Society program at this event. Years ago now, was a graduate student in the history department here at Chicago. And when I started teaching, I was really TAing. As a grad student, I kept noticing something, which was that the best students were all Law, Letters, and Societies students. And what does that mean? Did they get the best grades? Yeah, usually they got the best grades, but it wasn't just that. I mean, it's kind of what we've already heard already. They were the most curious students. They were the most imaginative, the most inquisitive, and they were also the most mature, which is something I'm going to come back to. This experience teaching as a graduate student clearly made an impression when I came back to Chicago to join the faculty in 2016, and shortly thereafter, Dennis stepped back from his role as chairman of Law Letters. I immediately reached out to the powers that be, who are all in the room, John Boyer, our dean, but also Liz Clemens, who was the master at that time, to ask to be considered for the position, and luckily for me, it worked out. What did I find when I joined the program? When I stepped in, what I found was sort of the real thing. The thing that we actually come to the University of Chicago for, and can find if we work hard enough. I mean, I'm sorry if this rankles anybody in the room. Looking at the room, I don't think it will. But nowadays, and this is okay, it has to be this way. A lot of our undergraduate programs, you have to stay up with the times. So you have to have, some bells and whistles. You got to have some merch. You got to have a stunning website. You need some tweets. You need some TikToks, this kind of thing. Law Letters did not have that. It has some of that now, but still very little. What it had was a genuine intellectual mission, a genuine intellectual identity. And my goal as the chairman has been to carry on and cultivate Dennis's legacy and really, just fly the flag that is the intellectual mission at the heart of the University of Chicago. What Dennis created at Law Letters is unique. It's not, right, Andrew, a pre-law major. If one looks at the alumni program, it's quite striking. Many alumni went to law school and became lawyers, became law professors. That is a good thing, it says here in my notes. Lawyers and law professors are all great people. But the diversity of the career tracks is really stunning. I mean, I have the kind of Excel spreadsheet on my computer. This is something I wanted to ask, but now I kind of understand. There's an extraordinary number of law letters graduates who became journalists. This is a real thing. There's many in public service, there's many in politics, many in nonprofits, many in academia, many in business. And that list kind of goes on. But one of the great things about joining Law Letters has been to learn about the lifelong differences that the program at Dennis made in the lives of so many alumni. I mean, this is not unique to hear the two voices on the stage. So what do Law Letters students get? When I became involved in Law Letters, one of the things I became interested in was the history of the program because I'm a historian. So this is what I can't help but doing. And there actually is an archive in the college where you can learn about the history of the program. And also a senior lecturer in the program, Sarah Johnson, she's also interested in this. We found some great stuff. So I thought I would read from a report about the mission of, at the time it was called Pearl, not Law Letters, of programs like this from 1982, the year that Dennis became affiliated with and soon enough the chairman of the program that was Politics, Economics, Rhetoric, and Law, the precursor to Law Letters, which was reformed in 1992 under Dennis's leadership. Okay, so this is from, what is this all about? It says here in this document, the purpose is, quote, to try different ways of fostering reflective thinking on broad intellectual issues in a faculty that is increasingly defined in terms of its disciplinary and professional commitments. In other words, to not try to start new programs for the sake of new programs, but to try diverse strategies for engaging faculty members and students in liberal education, the emphasis being on stimulating broad reflection on basic issues that are not confined to particular disciplines or even subject matters. Now, I don't know, it's a long time ago, Dennis. I don't know if you read this, report, maybe you even wrote it. I don't even know what the name at the bottom of it is. But it does strike me that, under your leadership, LSO fulfilled this mandate, that it gives students the chance to develop and also assert their intellectual autonomy by charting their own disciplinary path, this kind of discipline and dilettantism that we heard about, through the college, which clearly picks up on the broad training that's present in the core through the lens of the law. And the basic structure of Law Letters remains mostly the same as under Dennis's leadership. Students apply to the major, they take a course on legal reasoning, that's the gateway into it, and then the students have just an unusual degree of intellectual liberty to follow their intellectual curiosities, so long as the road leads back somehow to law. I think it is that freedom and the responsibility that comes with it that leads Law Letters students to just present themselves differently in the classroom and explains their kind of intellectual maturity, which is something I noticed as a first-time teacher decades ago and still notice to this day. We now ask students in the program to choose a focus field to organize their studies in the major, really just to have a record of where their curiosities led them, what they thought they were up to. And I thought just to give a sense of what the students are up to, I would just read off a few of these focus fields, because I think it does capture the richness and importance of Dennis's legacy in the program. So again, these are these focus fields. I chose 7. So these are current seniors, 4th-year students now. Childhood in the law is one. Another is collective action in cities. Third, gender, sexuality, and the family. 4th, law and economics. 5th, security in the state. Another, violence in the law. and finally, the political economy of gender. So that gives a kind of sense of what we're still up to today. We've also added something recently to the program, which is a BA thesis prize for the best senior thesis written by a law letters student, and it is named the Dennis Hutchinson Research Prize. A very small recognition relative to the giant size contribution and the remarkable efforts that Dennis made to build and create the Law, Letters, and Society program. So I'm happy to be here to congratulate you, Dennis, on this well-deserved tribute, and also just have the chance to thank you in public for building and passing on such a thriving program. And we do our best to carry on your legacy. So thank you.
So good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Tom Miles, Dean of the Law School, and it's a great thrill to welcome you, especially our colleagues from across the Midway. Thank you for coming over to join us to honor Dennis. And it's really wonderful to honor Dennis this afternoon, and it's especially wonderful to welcome this distinguished panel. When John and I were planning this event, we sort of think about, well, who might we invite? And I thought immediately of our first speaker, Jeff Wall, because I knew Jeff had been close to Dennis. And Jeff has a very distinguished career. He is a partner and the head of the Supreme Court in appellate litigation practice at Sullivan and Cromwell. He clerked for Judge J. Harvey Wilkinson of the Fourth Circuit and then for Justice Clarence Thomas of the Supreme Court. He's led a distinguished career in high levels of practice and government service. He has been twice acting Solicitor General of the United States and has argued about 30 or more cases in the U.S. Supreme Court, so you see why I wanted to speak before he did. And I remember when I emailed Jeff to ask him to do this, he immediately replied and said, for Dennis, absolutely yes. And I'm CCing this other guy, Jay Richardson, who said, I will come whether I speak on the panel or not, because that's how much Dennis means to me. And I then had this moment of thinking, could it really be that Jay Richardson from the Fourth Circuit? And it is Judge Jay Richardson of the Fourth Circuit who clerked for Judge Richard Posner of the Seventh Circuit, our retired senior lecturer, and then for the Chief Justice of the United States, William Rehnquist. He was in practice at Kellogg-Huber, and then was an assistant U.S. attorney in the District of South Carolina, where he handled a number of complex and high-profile cases. In 2018, he was confirmed to the Fourth Circuit, and I'm thrilled that he joined us today. It's wonderful for you to be here. And then we really thought, we'd really like to get for the panel Chris Eisgruber, but president of Princeton, extraordinary responsibilities. His time is incredibly valuable. He'll never be able to do it. And I invited him, and we had a phone call, and he said, for Dennis, I will come. And then I kind of just sheepishly said, well, here's the structure of the panel we're thinking of. You're not the main event. Dennis is the main event. But you said, for Dennis, I will come. And I'm so grateful to you. You also clerked first for Patrick Higginbotham on the Fifth Circuit, and then for Justice John Paul Stevens of the U.S. Supreme Court. And here, to emphasize our ties across the Midway, I want to emphasize that Justice Stevens was a graduate of the lab school and the college, class of 1941. President Eisgruber then had a distinguished career as a faculty member at NYU's law school, and then became the faculty director of the Law and Public Affairs program at Princeton, and then became provost at Princeton for 9 years, and since 2013, president of Princeton, where you have led Princeton through an amazing array of accomplishments, so many that it makes me very glad that Princeton does not have a law school. But we are thrilled, and I also have to mention that your educational journey also included a Rhodes Scholarship. And I'm especially proud that all three of our panelists today are graduates of our law school. And I think it's been quite some time since we had such a distinguished panel of graduates back at the law school, but it's all Dennis is doing. So with that, I will turn it over to Jeff Wall.
I'm really delighted that I have a chance to embarrass Professor Hutchinson, which has been many years in the making. So 20 years ago, I sat in the audience out in the auditorium for a talk by Professor Hutchinson about his then newly released book, The Forgotten Memoir of John Knox. A member of the faculty, who's not here today, fortunately, introduced the talk. And his theme was that law students fall into two camps: those who clerk, who plod down the well-trodden path laid before them, and those who chart their own course and dare to be wonderfully different. You can guess which camp that professor placed himself in. It seemed to me at the time that that way of looking at the world undersold the value of clerking, and with it the contributions of those like Professor Hutchinson, who have made that possible for so many. So on behalf of the conformists and the brass ring grabbers, I want to say a few words on behalf of our patron saint, Saint Dennis. Dennis Hutchinson literally shaped my life. If it were not for him, I very likely would not have clerked for Judge Wilkinson, where I met my wife and the mother of my kids. I married the judge's daughter. That's a separate story in which Dennis played no role. And I also certainly would not have clerked for Justice Thomas, where I made lifelong friends and found the work that I love. In the story of my life, Professor Hutchinson plays a truly important role. How many hundreds of Chicago alums would say the same thing? Judge Richardson will have more to say about that, but what a legacy in and of itself. Professor Hutchinson has genuinely cared about generations of law students. He's advocated for us. He has helped us have more interesting and fulfilling professional lives. He has helped to set us on paths that we have cherished. His caring has made a difference not only in our lives, it has enhanced the law school, from the students it attracts to the influence those students wield in the world. One of my clerk classmates is currently the legal advisor to the National Security Council. Jay is a judge. Dan Calabretta is poised to be confirmed as another. Others are at companies, firms, public interest organizations, academic posts. And we all have one thing in common. We all owe a measure of our success to Dennis Hutchinson. And if we reflect well on the law school, it owes a measure of that to him too. For 40 years, Dennis Hutchinson has helped make this law school the best in the country. One last story to drive home the point. When I was a 3L, Professor Hutchinson asked me to help him with the Law, Letters, and Society program. That eventually led to my teaching my own undergraduate seminar on current issues in constitutional law. Rebecca's smiling because she was in the back row. She did very well in the class. But, no offense to Rebecca, she didn't get the highest grade. That honor went to a student in the front row, Will Bode. Now, Will was going to become a brilliant legal scholar no matter what. He didn't need Dennis or me for that. But would he have become one here at Chicago if not for that early exposure and connection? Maybe only Will knows. But the point is that Professor Hutchinson's legacy ripples in ways none of us can fully appreciate. Before I went to law school, I studied philosophy in college. That was largely a waste, but for the price of a degree, I came away with one nugget of wisdom. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says, "A certain training in virtue arises from the company of the good, as Theognis has said before us." And I've always loved two things about that quote. The first is, most good ideas aren't new. History matters. And Professor Hutchinson has chronicled history, and in particular the Supreme Court in the 20th century and issues of race, with a sensitivity and nuance of few others. He has the soul of a true historian. Second, we are made better in the main simply by spending time with good people. Some of my favorite dinners here in Chicago and in Washington have been spent with Professor Hutchinson, and some of my least favorite mornings have been the ones after those dinners. We share a fondness for wine and brown liquor, gossip about judges and, yes, school administrators, and stories that press the bounds of artistic license. I know one is coming when he gets that twinkle in his eye and that sly half grin. My only sadness today is that law students to come will miss out on that. But how fortunate I feel to have come through this law school when I did. Professor Hutchinson, I'm lucky to have been made better by you. You were a teacher and mentor, and you have become a dear friend. Thank you for the faith you placed in me and for the gift of your friendship.
For the more than 20 years, I've been following Jeff's coattails around, and so I'm happy to be able to do it here. It really is a great honor to me to express my long-standing admiration and everlasting gratitude to Professor Hutchinson. When he wrote The Man Who Was Once Whizzer White, Professor Hutchinson lauded Justice White with terms that could well describe himself. A man who lacked pretense, valued modesty, possessed extraordinary breadth, and left a legacy of service. That legacy could be told by the dozens of articles, the 2 books that he published, or his work as an editor of the Supreme Court Review. But it would be best told by the many that graced the halls of this law school in the more than 40 years he served it. He was, as you've heard, devoted to students, working in the classroom to open their minds and create an unremitting passion for direct and disciplined argument. And outside the classroom, he was an ardent supporter of his students, keen to open doors when we left the law school. I am but one of the hundreds and hundreds of students on which he had a life-changing impact. But I think my own retail experience, though unique in its own way, is representative of the wholesale impact that he had on all of us. I met Professor Hutchinson the summer after my 1L year. I'd done what I thought was okay my first year, but had little insight into the opaque world of clerkships and the opportunities that they provided. On Jeff's recommendation, I sent my transcript and resume to Professor Hutchinson, and he arranged for me to meet. I cringe even now recalling that meeting. I knew so little, I'd spent basically no time preparing. But Professor Hutchinson slowly explained the process, helping me walk through the possible options and gave me guidance on how to apply. Despite my lack of preparation, I had one idea when I had shown up, and that was that I admired Dick Posner. Frankly, I didn't know much about him at the time, but I knew I admired him. So, when Professor Hutchinson made some passing reference to Dick, I immediately said that he would be my first choice, perhaps the only judge I could have named at the time. And although I didn't know it at the time, Professor Hutchinson's recommendation led to a call and an interview with Judge Posner. But apparently it didn't go too well. I left the interview, which was unusual, without having been offered a spot. I later learned that after the interview, Dick had called Professor Hutchinson, concerned, deeply I believe, about whether I was up to the task. Professor Hutchinson, thankfully, assured him that he should not judge the book by the cover. I was indeed better than my southern drawl, lack of polish, time spent surfing and working at a poolside bar and grill in Maui, and all the rest of my resume might suggest. And based on that recommendation and representation, Dick called and hired me. Perhaps Professor Hutchinson actually believed it. I doubt it, though. At no point in time did he ever ask me to be more of a dilettante. He didn't ask me to teach classes at the Law and Letters program. But whether he believed it or not, I now sit and certainly hope that he's not at all disappointed in having gone out on that limb. But Professor Hutchinson's interventions to help me despite myself continued. As I approached my third year of law school, I wanted to take Dick Posner's Advanced Antitrust Seminar. It was Dick's crowning class at the law school. By that point, I'd learned enough, and like many of my colleagues, I was regularly turning to Professor Hutchinson for advice and counsel about things in and outside of his area of expertise. So I took this question of what classes I was taking to Professor Hutchinson. And when I asked, he unapologetically and clearly said, "Jay, Dick currently believes that you're a mildly intelligent student who will serve him okay as a law clerk. You can only disabuse him of that notion. Don't you dare take his class." In truth, I think he saw his own reputation at risk, for he was the reason that I was to be there. And he wanted to delay the inevitable as long as possible. So needless to say, I stayed away. Whether in the advice that he gave, whether drinking beers at a Cubs game, during class, in his office, or otherwise, I look back so fondly and thankfully on my time with Professor Hutchinson. My law school experience would have been much less full without him. My career would have never started where it did, and I am quite confident that I would not have gotten where I am. His service to me is real and meaningful. But his real legacy of service is the hundreds and hundreds of others who could tell similar, though perhaps less embarrassing, stories of Dennis opening minds and doors for them. Dennis, thank you.
Well, these are very tough acts to follow. Tom, you told me I wouldn't be on the main event, but I didn't realize what was coming before me on the panel. There will be some common shared themes in these remarks, not surprisingly. But let me start just by observing that I suspect that every single one of us in this room have had teachers, I have no doubt, who shaped us for the better. Certainly, I feel very fortunate to have had many great teachers throughout my life, from grade school through law school. Very few of those teachers, however, had as much of an impact on me as did Dennis Hutchinson. And it's both a privilege and a pleasure to say a few words in his honor this afternoon. Unlike some of you who have spoken earlier, I actually don't remember exactly where or when I first met Dennis. It was a long time ago for me now, though it was sometime during the fall quarter of my first year at the law school back in 1985. What I do remember was that in the years following, Dennis was a generous source of counsel, friendship, mentorship, instruction, criticism, and encouragement for me, for several of my friends, and obviously for generations of other students. My own debts to Dennis are beyond counting. I'll mention just a few. He taught a seminar on American legal thought that was the best and most memorable course that I took at the law school. He supervised an independent paper that I wrote on John Marshall's judicial rhetoric, and when I became an assistant professor a few years later, he invited me to publish it in the Supreme Court Review. Dennis paired me with United States Circuit Court of Appeals Judge Patrick Higginbotham, for whom I clerked after graduating, and he wrote a letter recommending me when I applied for Supreme Court clerkships. He continued to read papers that I wrote after I had graduated, an enormous favor and above and beyond the call of duty by any measure, while also clearly mentoring the next generation of undergraduates and law students with the same intensity that he had showed to me and my classmates. And there were innumerable personal conversations about life and law, the kind of mentorship that students treasure and that universities celebrate. I should also add that Dennis mentored not only me, but also my wife, Lori Martin, who is now one of the country's best mutual fund lawyers. I'm not biased at all, and with a growing pro bono civil liberties docket to go along with it. He advised her student comment, and he helped find her a clerkship on the Fifth Circuit, where our judges would occasionally have sittings together in New Orleans. He had the two of us over to his home for dinner while we were still law students, an evening that both of us still remember and cherish. And Dennis, Lori sends her regards and thanks to you as well. Lori and I both benefited from Dennis's occasionally gruff, but undeniably constructive criticism. I remember him saying to me, maybe in my third year or just after I had graduated, "Chris, your student comment is pretty good. It's just badly written, that's all. You're too fond of complexity," or something like that. Up until the moment, I had thought that my student comment was beautifully written. I was very proud of my ornate prose, which was part of the problem. Dennis was right, and I pushed myself to simplify. I'm glad he said what he did, even if that's not what I felt at the time that he actually said it. Dennis said what needed to be said, and he said it in a way and in the context of a relationship where students could hear it. Like all great teachers, Dennis built his mentorship on a deep and intuitive understanding of the human character of the educational enterprise, the importance of exciting aspirations and imagination, the benefits of genuine feedback, and the capacity of students to grow, both as people and as thinkers. If Dennis's pedagogy leverages the human dimensions of education, his scholarship likewise reveals and probes the human character of the law. His seminar on American legal thought was a window into the politics and history of legal thought. It took legal doctrines and ideas seriously, and it took equally seriously the political, social, and professional struggles that shaped them. The course materials were a judiciously chosen collection of readings that brought old debates to life and inspired students to envision the various forces, intellectual and personal, at play in them. They influenced how I think about the behavior of legal institutions and how I think about the design of my own courses. I asked Dennis at one point during my student days why clerkships were worth doing. Maybe I had heard the speech, Jeff, of the person that you were mentioning, because I remember this conversation coming into Dennis and asking why clerkships were worth doing, credentials aside, and whether they would matter to the scholarship that I aspired to do. He said they would. He was right again, that I would benefit from seeing how judges did their work, and that this was especially so if I were lucky enough to get inside the Supreme Court building. He was right about that, as in so much of the other advice that he gave me. His own articles, especially like the ones about the quest for unanimity in Brown versus Board of Education, published in the Georgetown Law Review, and the Black-Jackson feud, published in the Supreme Court Review, are masterful descriptions of the court's decision-making. I commend those articles to any of you who have not read them. They reproduce beautifully the rich drama of judicial behavior with insights that extend far beyond the particular episodes and periods on which they focus. I feel privileged to be one among the many students who benefited from the insights, humanity, dedication, and generosity of Dennis Hutchinson. It's thus a pleasure to be here today with all of you and to say, along with many others who have learned so much, Dennis, from your guidance and instruction, thank you for what you have given to us. Congratulations on what you have achieved, and best wishes to you as you retire from a professional life that demonstrated what it is to be a teacher of the very best kind.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I think it's now appropriate to ask our guest of honor to respond.
I've heard it said that the ultimate conceit is to read your own obituary before going through the prerequisites. And I kind of feel the force of that observation today. Fortunately, I have been blessed with friendly and excessively generous obituary writers, for which I'm grateful. And it brings to mind a statement that was made to me when I paid Justice White the courtesy of telling him that I was going to write his biography. Slammed his hand down on the desk, and such a hand it was. He said, "You know what Oscar Wilde said about that?" And it was a moment of irreality. Justice White is quoting Oscar Wilde. It can't be true. And after the pause, he said, Wilde said, as to biography, death holds a new terror. And I think that was heartfelt in Justice White. I've been very blessed by the support I've received in this institution. It's allowed me to be better than I certainly otherwise would have been. And I remember a conversation I had at a round table, very small round table, it turned out to be lunch in the Quadriga Club 20 years ago. Edward Levy had just returned from, not just returned, but had returned from Washington, where he had rehabilitated the Department of Justice from its woebegone days, and was now teaching in both the college and law school. And his college courses emanated from the New Collegiate Division, Law, Letters, and Society, and I was the master at that point, thanks to John. And as we were walking out after lunch, Edward Levy looked at me with that kind of quizzical smile and said, "Oh, I take it I report to you now." Okay, what do I do? Well, I thought I had to be prepared when I found out we were going to have lunch together. And I'd read a lot of his writings, and I said, well, I think the job of a teacher, I'm saying this to Edward Levy, okay? The job of a teacher is to expand knowledge and to make sure that it is disseminated wisely. And he looked at me, got this little quirky grin, and said, well, that sounds pretty smart to me. And that's what I've tried to do. And I've been supported, as I was telling one of them beforehand, by no less than 8 deans in this university, 7 in this building, and John Boyer. And while the title of this symposium is talking about scholarship, and it's really kind of a ruse, that has already been revealed. It's talking a lot about teaching. Well, there's nothing wrong with teaching. And it is a place where ideas can be developed and disseminated, and that is scholarship at its best. I've had the fortune here of not only developing an undergraduate program, but of creating Stirrups Up, 8 courses in either the college or the law school. And in doing so, I think I've learned a great deal and have set a path for myself and for others in terms of intellectual exploration. And there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, in what other university could a half a dozen scholars get together and say, well, with each of our own particular expertises, what could we say about the conventional wisdom of competitive athletics? And so Alan Sanderson and I developed a course called Sports, Society, and Science. And we looked at the physics, of the curveball, and of batting. With Steve Sigler from the statistics department. We looked at how many at-bats would be necessary to have a true predictor as opposed to the 300. And Steve's calculation was it would take 10,000 at-bats in one season. Slightly more than is available. And then with a young and upcoming member of the psychology department, we talked about the science of choking. She's gone on to better things. She's now the president of Barnard and will become the president of Dartmouth next year. And Sam Belloc is a terrific colleague, Chris. I envy your president's meetings. So that's what the university has allowed me to do. And some people have benefited from it. I know I have. Now, it's easy to get imbued with a fanciness in talking about education and what it's supposed to do. And at bottom, it reminds me of a famous statement by an Oxford Don when he was asked, what is the purpose of educating? And his tart reply was to demonstrate to a young man when he's talking rubbish. And to a certain extent, with a friendlier 21st century tone, that's what the job is. But it's been an easier one for me because I've had terrific students. Thank you all. All of you have been here today. This is extremely generous by any standard.